On July 15th, 1976, in Chowchilla, California, a small cow town nestled in the San Joaquin Valley about 150 miles southeast of San Francisco, concerned parents, school officials, and local police desperately searched for a missing school bus containing 26 children and their elderly bus driver. The bus was hours overdue and had seemed to vanish without a trace. Little did they know that hours before, armed men had hijacked the school bus and at this very moment held their terrified children captive as they drove them over 100 miles away to a rock quarry in Livermore, California, to bury those children alive. This is the story of the Chowchilla Kidnapping, the largest mass kidnapping in U.S. history. On the evening of July 14th, 1976, 14-year-old Mike Marshall got in big trouble. His mother caught him with beer. And just like many parents of many teenagers who have been caught with beer, she had to come up with some punishments for young Michael. The punishments that she came up with may seem rather benign in the scheme of things. He was in summer school and she had always picked him up and driven him to school. And she told him, you know what? Tomorrow, I'm not picking you up. You are riding the bus. And the next day, because those were the last 2 days of summer school. So, you know what? You're going to ride the bus. It's over 90 degrees and enjoy that bus ride rather than getting picked up. And this may seem like a small little punishment in the scheme of things, but some may say that this punishment was sort of like a moment in the movie The Butterfly Effect or in the Final Destination movies. For this one decision had a ripple effect that impacted the lives of dozens of people. And had it not been for this small punishment that Mike's mom gave him, the course of the lives of everyone in the story may have gone completely differently. So, anyway, the next morning, young Michael, he woke up and went to school. It was a day sort of like any other day, except for instead of your average days of ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, this day the kids were taken from the Dairyland Public School and taken for a day of fun in the sun at the local public pool. So the children spent the day at the pool, laughing, playing, all of those things, and returned to the school. And after they returned to the school, it was time to load the kids on the school buses. So all of the kids headed out to the bus area and began boarding their buses. But when Mike got to the bus area, he realized, crap, I don't know what bus I'm supposed to ride because he hadn't had to ride the bus before. So he kind of looked around and he saw a face he recognized. And this was the face of 55-year-old Ed Ray. Now, Ed Ray was a school bus driver and a local farmer. He was known and loved by everybody. The kids loved him. Basically, everyone in town, respected him, loved him. He was a big part of the community. So Michael saw him and felt kind of a sense of relief. So he went up to Ed and just explained the situation, that he didn't know what bus he was supposed to ride and would it be okay, if he could give him a ride home. And Ed, being the kind man he was, told him, sure, hop aboard. So Michael hopped aboard. On board the bus, the children of, Dairyland School, they were having a good time. They were laughing and singing songs and smiling. Of course, it was a warm day, about 94, so they all had their windows down, and you can imagine their sun-kissed little cheeks after being at the pool all day, and, just kind of an idyllic summer day. It was nice and breezy, so the wind's just whipping everybody's hair, and the bus is rolling along. Bus makes its first 3 stops normal, routine, no problems, on time. And then after it gets through those 3 routine stops on time, the bus turns onto Avenue 21. And Avenue 21 in Chowchilla is where this nightmare really begins. Because on that street, Ed Ray, as soon as he turns the bus, sees a van parked across the street and it's blocking the narrow street. And so he kind of is like, what the heck? And he kind of comes up and, he considers trying to maybe go around the van. But, it's a small town. It's 4,600 people. Everybody knows everybody. So, of course, he's going to stop and he's going to find out if the people in the van are in need of assistance. If something's wrong, maybe they can offer some help. So he pulls up and stops. And this man jumps out of the van and runs over and bangs on the bus door and says, "Open the door." And Ed is like, "What?" Because the guy's got a nylon stocking pulled down over his face. And so Ed is just, he goes ahead and opens the door. He's just caught off guard. He's not, this isn't a pre thought out decision. So he opens the door of the bus and he's like, "What's going on?" And in that moment, the ambush unfolded. The man rushed onto the bus carrying a chrome handgun, and he was followed up the stairs by another man, also his face distorted by a nylon stocking pulled down over his face, and he's carrying a double barrel sawed off shotgun. And they order Ed Ray out of his seat into the back of the bus. Now, there are various accounts of exactly how Ed responded to this intrusion on the bus. But my favorite account of this is that Ed gave him quite a bit of gaff before he moved to the back of the bus. He put up kind of a fight, but at the same time, he's a grown man, he's a farmer. He knows very well that a sawed off double barrel shotgun on a bus full of little tiny heads peeking above the seat is an extremely dangerous situation. If you don't know, the reason why you would saw off the barrel of a shotgun is to make it where it sprays out a wider spray of, little pellets or whatever kind of ammo is in the shotgun is full of tiny little projectiles of, it's various sizes depending on the type of round that is in there. But either way, it comes out of the end of the shotgun and then it begins to spray out. So if you saw it off, it starts spraying really, really wide, really early. And you can imagine that this is a lethal and very, very real danger on a bus full of little children. So Ed goes ahead and complies, and he goes all the way to the back of the bus and he sits down. You have to understand this is going on in a matter of seconds. It's very confusing, it's scary, and he is making the best decisions that he can in this moment. This is 1976. Nothing like this has ever happened in the history of our country. No one could even begin to fathom that anyone would take a school bus. No one's had any training for these kinds of things. He hasn't heard any stories before that he could think, like we have the luxury of. If, something like that happened to me, I would do this, because you've heard the story now. So you have that in your mind. You've thought a little bit about what you might do. Ed had none of these things. He lived in a small town where people didn't lock their doors. Nothing bad had ever happened. And this was just a total shock. So he did what they told him. He got to the back of the bus. One little gentleman on the bus, Larry Park, he was 6 years old. And he turned to one of the men at this point and he said, "If you don't have me home on time, my daddy's going to be on you like stink on skunk." And that little boy, he said up until that day, he had never known what true fear was. But he was about to learn, as would everyone aboard that bus. The kidnapper that wielded the chrome handgun slid into the driver's seat and began driving the bus. This ride was not very long, but it was terrifying for the children. As they began to drive and that double barrel shotgun was pointed at those kids, little Larry Park began to wonder, what is it going to feel like to die? Another little girl on the bus, 10-year-old Jody Heffington, as little Larry sat there frozen in fear toward the front, she wondered, what is going on? She didn't know anything about guns really, but she did know that when bad guys had stockings pulled down over their faces, that nothing good was about to happen. Wasn't good. So everyone rode along, and Ed Ray sat in the back, and he was barking orders at the kids, "Sit down, be quiet, do what they tell you to do." He was very harsh, very harshly spoken. Little Jennifer Brown on the bus, she was 9 at the time, and she said Ed was speaking in a really harsh tone, and this was not the Edward that we knew and loved. So the children are catching on to the fact that whatever's going on is very serious. The adult they know and love is barking orders and being very harsh with them. There are men with guns. And they said that another weird phenomenon about these hijackers and kidnappers was the way the nylon stockings being pulled over their face and the time of day it was with the light about 4 p.m. It just made it where their eyes looked like hollow sockets, just like black holes in their face. And one of the kids said it was like looking at death. So these are almost like monsters to the children, you can imagine. And so the bus drives along for a little bit further and finally pulls off the road. pulls off the road down into this dry creek bed, and there's a huge, tall bamboo grove now growing there. This time of the year, the creeks run dry and the bamboo grows. So it was super high. The bus drives deep into the bamboo grove and parks. So now the bus is completely obscured from sight. It cannot be seen from the road. It can't be seen from the ground. The bus stops. As the bus is parked in this bamboo grove, another van pulls up and it backs up to the bus. And this van is a white van. It backs all the way up to the doors of the bus. They open the doors of the van and they open the doors of the bus and they line the children up and they tell the children are now going to jump from the bus into the back of the van. These vans are former military prison, police transport vans. So these vans are military police for military prisoners. So they were already secure to begin with. The kidnappers have further modified these. They've put in plywood walls to separate the driver's compartment from the back. They have painted all the windows to make it light tight and so no one can see in, no one can see out. They have soundproofed these vans so no one can hear. No one who's inside can hear what's going on outside. No one who's outside can hear what's going on inside. So the oldest child, Mike Marshall, is told to jump. The youngest child, 5-year-old Monica, she's told to jump over there along with several other children. And the children are jumping one at a time. Finally, little 10-year-old Jody Heffington, she comes down and it's her turn to jump. But right before she jumps, the man with the double barrel sawed-off shotgun shoves that shotgun into her little stomach. And in that moment, she kind of panics and she's like, "Look, I was doing what you said, like, what are you doing?" And she really thought he was going to kill her. She thought he was going to shoot her right then and there. And he didn't say a word to her. He just stood there holding that shotgun in her stomach as they shut the door on that van and the van drove away. Next backs up a green van. And into that van, Jody is then told to jump. But you can imagine it must have felt like a million years waiting for that van to appear and then pull up while you have a shotgun shoved in your stomach as a little child. And so she does. She jumps over. Jennifer Brown is on that van. Ed Ray, the bus driver, is on this van. After all the rest of the children on the bus are loaded into this van, the doors are shut. There are 19 little girls and 7 little boys on these vans. And you can imagine as this is going on how Ed Ray must be feeling. He is responsible for these children. Loves all these children. He knows them all. And with everything that's going on, you can imagine what he has to be feeling. It just, God, these guys, like, what are they going to do? Are they going to hurt them? Are they going to kill them? Are they going to do other horrible things to them? Like, where are we going? All of those thoughts. If you've ever had one of those dreams where something terrible like this was happening to you, you know what that terror feels like. So anyway, the doors are shut on these vans and these vans pull away. In the meantime, the parents and the police and everyone, they're still looking like crazy. Joan Brown, who's Jennifer's mother, she gets home from work about an hour later. The kidnapping occurred at 4. She gets home around 5 o'clock. This is when parents are first starting to realize that something isn't right because she got home at 5 o'clock and normally she expected to open the door and at least see her daughter's things and see, like maybe a chair pushed up to the countertop with some peanut butter and bread out or something to make a snack left out, those sorts of things. But she walked into a dead silent house that was pristine. Nothing was out of place from how they left it that morning. And she knew, like, this isn't normal, but she thought, well, maybe something's going on. I'll wait a little longer. So she began to wait. And 1 hour turned into 2 hours, and everybody began the search. They started off by following the bus route. The parents and the police just trying to see if maybe the bus was broken down somewhere along the route, if they found them, what was going on. But it seemed to be after those first 3 stops that bus had vanished off the face of the earth. So a police helicopter went up into the air and it joined the hunt. Sunset was due about 8:18 p.m. that night, and a little while before sunset, the police helicopter kind of radioed in the news that everybody was and waiting for that. I see the bus. The bus is in a bamboo grove about 7 miles outside of Chowchilla. So the sheriff gets in his car along with some other people and they rush to the scene. I'm sure at this point they're expecting to find that maybe Ed Ray's gotten disoriented or something's happened and they've gotten off track and they're stuck or, something. But they get there and they make their way to the bus. And the local sheriff, Sheriff Bates, he's just absolutely horrified by what he finds. He finds an empty school bus, no sign of any children, no sign of Ed Ray, and these tire tracks coming right up to the door of the bus. And he just knew in his gut in that moment that the children of his town of Chowchilla had become victims of some type of bizarre and brazen mass kidnapping. So he immediately set to work. He contacted the governor, he contacted the FBI, and since this was the largest mass kidnapping in US history, you can imagine that the response was intense and immediate. The governor basically signed a blank check. Anything you need to find these kids, let's do it. He had all the funding, all the law enforcement agencies were completely at his, discretion. They were coming. Cavalry was on the way. In the meantime, they told the parents to meet up at the fire station. So all these parents who are now faced with the fact that something is very, very wrong. Their children are missing. They've been taken by someone. Of course, people are saying, what if it was Ed Ray is doing this or things like that? And there's all kinds of theories going around. The parents are terrified and some of them just don't know what to think. The media is also getting wind of this and they're starting to converge on this town. The FBI has sent 30 FBI agents. They've rented every empty hotel room in town and things are really starting to pick up fairly quickly. All the phone lines are beginning to get tied up. It's getting very difficult to get calls in or out, especially the phone lines to the police station are completely jammed. So, because of this circus is going on and the hours are slipping by and these kids are still not found and still not found, it's getting later and later. Pacific Bell heard about the issue with the phone lines, so they offered to donate lines and sent linemen in to start putting up dozens and dozens of phone lines because this was back before cell phones. So everybody's calls went through the landlines, and the landlines only had so much capacity. If you had two phone numbers, we're talking about a police department who usually only had one officer on patrol, the sheriff, and then one officer on patrol. And that's how big this was, the police department. So you can imagine they don't have a lot of phone numbers going to their police station for, those in and out calls. So all the lines are constantly being tied up there. And law enforcement, they had virtually no clues at this point. They just had the tire tracks, the kids had vanished into thin air, and the media really wasn't helping either. You see, the media started to give false reports about maybe this was the Zodiac killer, because in one of Zodiac's letters several years before, he mentioned something about targeting a school bus. You got the media speculating the Zodiac killer's taken the children. You have others speculating Ed Ray has taken the children. You have other people, making even more wild. Some people were even saying Son of Sam has something to do with this and everything else. So these poor, poor parents, like hearing all of these things, the FBI, they were grasping at straws just about as badly as the media. They had heard about the 1958 novel, The Day the Children Vanished, and the plot of that novel was about a gang that kidnapped a bus full of children as a distraction so they could rob the local bank. Well, Ed Ray just happened to be married to a woman named Odessa, and Odessa was a teller at the local Bank of America. So they thought, well, maybe this is possible. What if Ed Ray and Odessa are in on this? Or what if, someone's kidnapped the children to rob the local bank and things like that? So the FBI, having not much else to do and not many other leads to go on, one of the things that they did was they put the local bank under surveillance as well. And as all of the, wild rumors and drama and everything are going on, the children of Chowchilla were suffering. They were packed in the back of these vans that are light proof, soundproof. They're hot. They're being driven around the San Joaquin Valley, around and around and driving and driving and driving. And these are kids who have been swimming all day. They've been at school all day. They haven't had their dinner. They're starving and they're young. These children range in age from 5 to 14 years old. These are young kids, most of them very young. They are hungry. They are tired, they have no access to a bathroom, and they are terrified. It is nighttime. They're used to being tucked in by their mommies and daddies after a nice dinner, and they are in total blackness, being driven around, total confusion. They have no idea what's going on. Some of the children are starting to have fainting spells. These fainting spells are from various causes: heat exhaustion, terror. Poor little Jody bumped into Jennifer in the darkness. They bumped into each other, and Jody gets a nosebleed in the dark. So you've got kids that are having things like this happen. Kids are pounding on the divider, let us go, please let us out. Just begging and pleading with these guys, let us out, please. The kidnappers just yell back at them, shut up, shut up. And at one point, little Jennifer said she was able to kind of like peek through this tiny crack where she could see into the driver's area of the van. And she said that she could see the man driving their van, like having a nice soda and in the air conditioning. And, that made her even more upset because there they are, just thirsty and hungry and suffering. And there he is, just driving, drinking a soda with the air conditioning. So that made her even more angry at the men, of course. 6-year-old Larry Park said that during that time, he was sort of just like drifting in and out of consciousness, in and out of sleep. And he was dreaming of like where he and his family would go camping and in the forest. And so the kids packed in these humid, hot vans are pretty miserable. 9-year-old Jennifer is comforting, 5 and 6-year-olds that are clinging to her and crying, just trying to tell them it's going to be okay. And after around 11 hours of driving, 11 and a half hours, it's about 3:30 in the morning now, the vans exit the road and they head off into the gravel quarry. So it's a road down in there, and they've got to stop and unlock a gate with a key and then continue on down, and all of that. So you imagine it kind of stops, the kids wait, then the vans roll again, they roll up. Finally, the vans stop. But because of this rough gravel road and all the bouncing and jostling and driving off road a little bit, of course, all the kids are now awake. They've been bounced and knocked all around. They're wide awake. They're terrified. They're exhausted. They're starving. They have to go to the bathroom, and they still have no idea what's going on. And the vans just sit there and sit there and sit there for an hour. An hour goes by, and finally, the back doors of the van burst open. Of the van, Ed, Ray, Jody, and Jennifer, and the doors burst open and flashlights just shine in, and they're blinding everybody in the van. Nobody can see. They've been in this totally dark van, and now they have these flashlights shining in with pitch blackness outside, and arms just go in. They grab Ed Ray, yank Ed Ray out, and the door's shut, and the kids are now there without him. And they can't hear what's going on either because it's soundproof. So a few minutes later, the doors fly open again. In come hands. They grab out a child and yank them out and shut the door. And the doors open again. Flashlights, grab the child, back out, bam. And so the other kids in the van start thinking, oh God, what if they're pulling us out one by one and killing us? Is that what's happening? Are they pulling us out one by one and killing us? So the kids start to back up. They start to move back, get as far away from the doors as they can. They really truly believe now at this point that that's probably what's going on, is they're being yanked out and murdered one by one. Finally, it gets down where it is just 10-year-old Jody, and she's alone in the van. So anyway, the kidnappers finally open the doors and yank Jody out, and they're blinding her, and she's upset by this point. She thinks they're going to kill her. She doesn't hear anybody. She doesn't see anybody. She thinks they've killed everybody. All my friends that were in here. Now it's my turn. And they say, what's your name? And she was a little firecracker. And she said, Puddin' Tame, ask me again and I'll tell you the same. Part of a popular children's rhyme back then. But then the kidnapper, in a very menacing voice, told her, tell me your name or you're never going to see your parents again. And so, what's she going to do? She's a 10-year-old little girl. These are 3 armed men demanding this. So she tells them her name and age, and they take some personal items. So each person they're taking off, from Ed Ray, they took some of his clothing and his boots. And, from each child, they're taking clothing and things like that, personal objects from them. And so they lowered the flashlight out of her face at that point after they had taken her things and gotten her name and age. And they told her down the hole. And they point to this hole. So she can see she's in some sort of like canopy tent thing. And there's a hole in the ground over there. So she walks over to this hole. with like doom and trepidation surging through her veins. She doesn't know what's about that. She doesn't know she's going to look down and in the hole is going to be the dead bodies of everyone. She doesn't know like what she's walking toward, what if they're going to kill her, shoot her from behind once she gets to the hole, or what's going to happen. So she makes her way to the hole and she looks down, and much to her relief, she sees Ed Ray down there with the flashlight along with all the other children that have gone before her from her van. So she knows at least that everyone's alive down there. And she climbs down the ladder, and she joins them. So meanwhile, in the white van where 14-year-old Mike is, with the young children in his group, they're also clinging to him and they're crying and they're scared. And the same thing starts happening in their van. The doors fly open, flashlights blind everybody, arms come in, snatch a child, yank them out, kicking and screaming. The doors close. And the other kids are in there left to their imagination as to what is going on when they're pulled out. And Mike thinks the same thing. Mike thinks that they're probably killing them. And he's got this 5-year-old little girl in his arms, little Monica. And he just couldn't bear, if that's what was happening, that they were pulling them out and they were really killing them, he could not bear to just hand this little girl over. So he decides he's going to take her off of him, and that the next time the doors open, now it's down to just the two of them, the next time those doors open, he's just going to put himself there, because he cannot live with handing this little girl or letting this little girl go before him if that's what's going on. So the doors open, he offers himself, they pull him out, flashlights in his face, take his name, take his age, take some things from him, and tell him down the hole. And so he goes over there thinking the same thing that Jody had, and looks down and is, thank God the kids are alive. And he starts climbing down the ladder, and he's hearing them, Mikey, Mike, it's Mikey, it's Mikey. And the little kids are excited, and he climbs down, he starts hugging them and, telling them we're going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Everything's going to be okay. And then he sees little Monica starting to make her way down the ladder, and he's just like, oh, thank God. So that's a small sense of relief. Very, very short-lived, because as soon as Monica's down there, they yank up the ladder. They toss a roll of toilet paper down and they tell the kids, we'll be back. And then they just hear something slam over the top of that opening. What they're hearing slam over the top of that opening is a 200-pound manhole cover. And then they hear another couple huge bangs as industrial tractor batteries, 2 of them, are put down on top of that. And then the most chilling sound of all, then they have to sit there in the hole that they're in, just listening to dirt falling over those things that were just placed on top of the hole. So they had to hear themselves being buried alive. Now, the place they were put into was about 8 by 16 feet. And what it was the kidnappers had buried an old moving truck, sort of an old furniture moving truck. So kind of like a box truck, an older version of like a U-Haul, the ones that have the 16-foot back, where it's like 8 feet by 16 feet. There's rebar reinforcing the walls and the ceiling. There's like wood pillars that have been placed in there to hold everything, like, hold the walls out, hold the ceiling up. Because, that thin metal those trucks are made out of, that's not really meant to have thousands of pounds of pressure from the dirt and stuff pushing in on all sides of them. They're meant to be filled from the inside and maybe have some pressure pushing out, but not all that weight from all the dirt that's on top of that. So it's reinforced. Ed Ray has a flashlight, so him and Michael will begin checking like every corner, every hole, every nook and cranny of this place, trying to figure out, like, is there a way out? But all they find is, that there really isn't. There's just this, the rebar, the pillars, there's a couple holes and made in the wheel wells inside. And I don't know if they knew at the time those are supposed to be toilets, or if that's just something that kidnappers later informed people, is that's what it was supposed to have been for, was those holes are supposed to be toilets. But either way, that's why those holes are cut in the wheel well, to be crude toilets. They could hear the hum of fans, so there was some sort of ventilation system, and there was a battery-powered ventilation system that was turning over the air once about every 25 minutes to the compartment. There were some mattresses and box springs tossed in there. There was like a table in there. There were 5 10-gallon or 10 like 5-gallon little things of water in there, and just some random food things. So there's like a box of cereal with no milk. There's a loaf of bread, some peanut butter, some potato chips, just random like kid snack foods and things. And there's, 26 kids, and there's like a loaf of bread and, things like that. So the kids sit down and they start having something to eat, something to drink. It's about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, something like that. So after the kids are done eating and drinking, in the meantime, like Ed and Mike, they're trying to like push the manhole cover. Mike's standing on Ed's shoulders and they're trying to move this thing and they're making no headway. I mean, it is just not budging. So Ed kind of decides at this point, now that the kids are a little more settled, they've had something to eat, they've had something to drink, like maybe it's time that everybody just gets some sleep. The kidnappers did say we'll be back before they lock them in. So he just figures, everybody needs to just go to sleep. Maybe that would be the best thing. We'll conserve the air, the water, all that if everyone just gets some rest. So everybody lays down and starts to try and sleep. And Mike says that there's kind of this phenomenon that was occurring at the time where it would get real quiet in there, and then one of the kids would burst out crying. When that one kid would lose it and burst out crying, the whole hole would just totally erupt with just the terrified sobs and cries and shrieks of all these little kids who are just absolutely terrified. They've never known darkness that deep and dark. They've This is just horrifying, they don't know what to do. So this goes on, and even 14-year-old Michael said, at one point he temporarily gave into the hopelessness and despair and began to cry a little bit too, because he just was thinking of his mom. He just kept thinking of the last time he saw his mom and wishing that he'd said goodbye to his mom and had a chance to really tell her goodbye and things like that. And in the meantime, Michael's mother, by now the hours are going by and it's daylight again. The kids are still missing. And Mike's mother's gathered with all the other anxious parents at the fire station and was being interviewed by CBS News. CBS was broadcasting the news to a stunned nation. The nation had stopped a lot of its bicentennial celebrations because of 1976, so it's 200 years from the founding of the country. This is in July, so there are a lot of bicentennial celebrations still occurring. All the celebrations are now paused. The president is aware of this. The president has signed a blank check. You have all resources, whatever you need. Let's find these kids. Everyone's telling the parents, don't worry, someone will call soon with demands. Someone will call. That's why you kidnap, is for ransom, obviously. So someone's going to call with demands for all these kids. They didn't just take them for no reason. And CBS News, their excerpt from their report is, throughout much of this day, parents and other family members of the missing children came to the command post set up in downtown Chowchilla to try desperately to fathom some reason out of this madness. A reporter from CBS asked Michael's mom, Carol Marshall, is there any chance all of this could be some kind of hoax or, maybe a joke somebody's playing or something along those lines? And I cannot imagine being in Carol Marshall's shoes, because I probably would not have been as graceful as she if someone's asking me all these speculative questions like that. But she had a lot more grace, and she just said, I imagine there's a chance. I hope that is all it is. So the reporter concluded that story with the chilling words that so far there's been no word from the abductors. And that was the scariest part for everyone. Is now the kids have been gone all night. We're getting into the next day and the abductors still have not called. There's still no demands. No one knows what's going on, where the children are. By now they could be in Mexico. By now they could be loaded on a ship in a port, headed out to sea. No one knows where the heck these kids are. It was like the ground, and there's no clues. So it's like the ground itself just opened up and swallowed these kids. But little did anyone know that's pretty much exactly what was starting to happen to those kids in that moment. You see, about 12 hours into the confinement in the hole, conditions were rapidly deteriorating. The ventilation system had now stopped working, so the air was no longer being turned over. It was getting more hot, more humid, more stifling. One of the little boys had gone around and been kicking the wood blocks out from under these pillars, so the support for the walls and ceilings had been weakened, and now the ceiling is starting to buckle and cave in. The walls are starting to bow in. Some dirt starting to trickle in here and there and breaks in the seams. And the terrified children are beginning to scream and shriek and cry out. Little Jennifer said that a 13-year-old girl in there told her that the air was disappearing. And you have to think, at that moment, Jennifer said she just thought the whole thing was going to cave in and they'd all be squished. So that's what's going through the minds of these 26 children in Ed Ray right now, is they're running out of air and they're about to suffocate. And any second, that ceiling's just going to finish collapsing. The walls are going to come in. They're all going to get squished and killed. And even Ed Ray at this point is starting to lose hope. Jennifer, she tries to help out and she starts trying to sing, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands." But not one child in the whole hole was happy and no one clapped their hands. So she abandoned that attempt pretty much right away. The air was stagnant, stifling, completely befouled with the stench of soiled children who had gone to the bathroom on themselves. The dust was raining down. It was starting to get hard to breathe between the humidity, the dust, the stagnant air, the smell. Everyone was, kind of stripping down to their underwear, just pouring sweat. And by this point, Ed Ray was completely exhausted. And he just put his head in his hands and started to cry. It had been over 30 hours since this started, and he had lost hope, and he started to lament that they were all doomed and dead. And that was it. Around that time in Chowchilla, Jennifer's mother, she started a prayer to God. And she just said, "God, if you bring them back, if you just bring them back, I will, I will." And she just stopped because what do you offer God in exchange for the lives of 26 little kids? What do you have that's worth 26 kids' lives, So she didn't have anything to offer God. So she stopped praying. The children really began to believe, this is it. We're going to die. And they began to give up hope. But that's when 14-year-old Michael looked around at all of this. No. No, 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 this was not the way it was going to happen. So he went around, he rallied Ed Ray. "Snap out of it. We are going to escape. We are going to get out of here. No, this is not the end, guys. Stop, stop. This is not the end. We're going to get out of here. We got to try and get out of here. We've got to do this. We've got to try." And so he rallied them. And Jennifer said that Ed Ray and the older kids, they all decided that if we die, we are going to die trying to get out of here. We're not going to die crying and terrified in this hole. We're going to die trying to escape. So amen. Amen, you little legends. That's the way to, that's the American spirit right there. I always tell my kids when there's an emergency, never panic. Just think there's always a solution. You just have to think outside the box. Don't panic and just think about it. And that's what those kids did that day in that hole. Those kids in Ed Ray, they started to think. And they stacked every mattress up underneath that hole as high as they could get. They either took turns climbing on the mattresses, standing on each other's shoulders. Jody was young and strong. She was only 10, but she was stout and she was strong. She could handle like Michael's weight on her shoulders. Ed could handle Michael's weight. So the bigger kids are taking turns climbing on the mattresses, climbing on each other's shoulders, on Ed's shoulders. They're working at this hole. They're shoving it, pushing it, jamming it, levering it, doing whatever they can. Ed Ray and Michael broke up a box springs and were using some of the wood like a lever, trying to move it. So as Michael climbs up on Ed Ray's shoulders for the last time, there is this sense of hope that goes through the crowd. And the children all start cheering, "Come on, Michael, come on. You can do it. You can do it. Come on, Michael, you can do it." And they're clapping and they're cheering. And Michael climbs up on Ed's shoulders. And he and Ed had broken up a box spring to use it as a lever. And they are prying at this manhole cover. And he is trying. And little Larry Park would later recount that when he looked at Michael that day up there on Ed's shoulders, that there was no quit in Michael, that the determination and just absolute focus of Michael, that he would not stop. There was no quit in him. And by some miracle, that young boy standing on the shoulders of that elderly man budged that manhole cover. And when it budged and dirt started raining in, he said that dirt raining in looked like little shooting stars shooting in there because the light came pouring in too, and that shaft of light with the dirt streaking through. And all the kids just were so excited. But everybody was scared. And Ed and Michael had already talked about, what if they're up there guarding the hole? So as Michael pushed the stuff aside, he kind of cautiously peeked up to see if there were kidnappers guarding the hole. And he found that there was nobody there, that they seemed to be in the foothills somewhere, that there was no one around. And so he kind of climbed out of the hole and it's like, the coast is clear. And so as soon as he said the coast is clear, they started passing the children up. And they're passing the children up through the hole and putting them to the side, next child, next child, next child. And they get all of these kids up and out of the hole. Now, I've heard it a couple different accounts, whether they all went as one group. Some accounts say Michael sort of hid in this little patch of woods nearby in case the kidnappers did catch Ed Ray and the other kids, that Michael was going to flee for help. So one of those two scenarios, but either way, the kids are free. And as they're walking through this quarry, the little kid said it looked like the Flintstones because, the Fred Flintstone works in the quarry. So they walk through the quarry and they present themselves to the quarry security guard. And men in hard hats are standing around just gawking because you can imagine this scene. These kids are stripped down, they're sweaty, they're covered in dirt, and they're filthy. They've been crying. They're, just in a total various states of dress and disarray and filthy. And they're down in a rock quarry that's locked behind a locked gate that no one's supposed to be down. And all of a sudden, all these kids just come wandering up. So everybody's kind of just like, what in the world? So, of course, the quarry security guard immediately calls the police. And the police come and they photograph every child. And after they photograph every child, they load these kids into Alameda jail buses, which is probably the last place that these kids want to be, is buses, after they're just on a hijacked bus and kidnapped. But either way, they're loaded onto buses. And they're taken to the only place that is big enough to house that many kids in that area temporarily, which is the local jail. So you can imagine these kids, they just got hijacked on a bus, taken and locked up somewhere, and now they're on a bus and they're rolling through these tall barbed wire, topped fences tall fences, barbed wire tops, to a jail. So some of the kids are a little alarmed, a little shaken up. They're still leery, they're confused, things like that. So they get to the jail and they're taken out of the buses and taken to an area where it's more like classrooms, and they're put into these rooms. And they bring them sodas and apples, and then they bring them some prisoners' coveralls. So, of course, they tried to roll up the sleeves for the kids, but little kids, they found that they could flap their sleeves around. So you got little kids flapping their sleeves around, having little sleeve fights and being silly as the food and the soda and all of the relief of finally being free starts to flood in. So they take these kids and they take the kids to one at a time to the doctor. And the doctor there examines the children, does a full body exam, and then sends them into another room where they are individually interrogated, or their statements are taken by law enforcement. So after each individual child has been checked out by the doctor and they've all given their statements, they are then going to be taken back to Chowchilla. So this takes about 4 hours for all of this to go on. And in the meantime, Greyhound has heard about the kids' rescue, and they've sent some buses and drivers, some Greyhound buses and drivers, to the jail to pick up the kids and take them home to Chowchilla, which is over 100-mile ride. So they want the kids to be comfortable and all of that. So they donate the buses and the drivers to drive the children home. So the children are finally loaded up on all these buses. They were rescued they escaped around 8 o'clock at night, finished up being photographed and checked out medically and interrogated and all this thing, about midnight, and loaded on the buses. and sent back over 100 miles. So at about 4 o'clock in the morning, these buses arrive in Chowchilla. And the children are absolutely swarmed with reporters and flashes and microphones being thrust into their face in this mob of strangers because all their parents are inside the building that they're supposed to be walked to, waiting for them. So they're still not seeing their moms and dads. They're finally home, but where are my parents? The reporters are yelling things like, Mike, how you doing? What was the pit like? And things like that. In the meantime, their parents that they're about to be handed off to have absolutely no idea what has happened to their kids. They do not know their kids have been held at gunpoint. They do not know their kids have been buried. They do not know their kids have been held in a hole underground and buried alive. They don't know anything other than their kids were found. That was all they were told. Your kids have been found and they're alive. They had no idea what their kids had been through. Even little 6-year-old Larry, he was sort of just handed off by this strange man who carried him off the bus, handed over to his mother and placed in his mother's arm. He was so exhausted and everything. He just said, "Hi, Mom," and fell right back asleep. So Jody says, after this point, that nothing was ever the same again. The kids may be back, but they were scarred and traumatized. And in 1976, they didn't recognize PTSD from things like this. They knew about like being shell shocked, but they didn't understand the psychological impact that an event like this would have on little kids. And so they didn't really get much help at all these little kids. Little Larry would wake up from dreams that he was falling into these deep, dark holes he couldn't get out of, and he would just be hysterical and crying. And his mother, all she could do was really hug him and comfort him, tell him it's going to be okay. And Jennifer Brown, she would have these horrible dreams where the kidnappers did take him out of the vans and line them up and shoot all of them. And she would wake up crying from those dreams. So even though the kids were home, their ordeal was really far from over. And from several of them, it would lead to a lifetime of addiction, alcoholism, just general being unwell mentally and emotionally. So now that the children are returned to their parents, the police and the FBI are setting out to find out who did this and why did they do this. The who and why of the situation. Luckily for them, it turned out that the kidnappers were complete and utter idiots, just total morons. They left mountains of evidence behind, so it made it real easy to figure out the who, not so much the why, because in finding out the who, it made the why even stranger. So now that we've kind of gone through the story and you've heard about what this was like from the children's point of view, let's talk about the 3 gigantic idiots who perpetrated this crime. I'll call this tale the tale of the 3 morons. So I'm sure it occurred to you as I told this story that a lot of this sounded really Hollywood like, the hijacking and the stalking mask and the kidnapper vans and the hole in the ground. Very dramatic, very theatrical almost. It doesn't sound like something a gang of hardened, wizened criminals would do. It's more like something a villain in a movie would do, right? Or some kind of action movie plot. But, you're not too far off when you think about this because the lead moron in the story is a 24-year-old man named Fred Newell Woods. Now, Fred Woods has a much fancier, longer name, but let's just go with Fred and Fred Woods because that really suits this man better. His family, he came from a very old money family, extremely wealthy. The family businesses were bringing in about $350 million a year back in 1976. He was a descendant of Henry Mayo Newell, of which the town of Newell, California is named after. Mr. Newell made his fortune in real estate speculation, railroads, oil, and ranching, and this left the subsequent generations of his family among the elitist of the elites of California in that time period. So, I mean, he basically grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. Why would someone like that kidnap a bus of children? Well, after failing to live up to his father's expectations, he had moved into a converted outbuilding that he made into an apartment on his family's 80-acre estate. He had a devout follower in his friend James Schoenfeld, who is also age 24 like Fred. And James Schoenfeld had a younger brother, Richard or Rick Schoenfeld, who was 22. Those two were the sons of a podiatrist. So they came from doctor money, but not old money like Fred. So James, of course, kind of followed Fred around and looked up to Fred and did try to be cool for Fred because Fred was his super rich friend. The Schoenfeld brothers, they kind of had it hard in their own way because their father, being a podiatrist, moved them to an area where people like Fred's family lived. So the kids were always feeling like they weren't ever good enough. They didn't ever have everything that everybody had. They, were just always a little behind. They were lacking compared to all the other kids who came from old money. But Fred, he wasn't very smart, and neither was James. They just weren't very intelligent people. They would try and start like businesses together, and their businesses would fail because they just didn't have kind of the mental fortitude to work it out. Fred even struggled with the correct spelling of like the simplest words. He even managed to misspell FBI in a letter that he wrote. So that just kind of goes to show his criminal mastermind, how smart he was. He can't spell a three-letter word that's literally three letters, FBI, and he still can't spell it correctly. So you can imagine. So Fred had aspirations to be none other than a film producer. And the kidnapping turned out to be partially inspired by the scene of a bus hijacking from the movie Dirty Harry. Now, when I think about that bus hijacking, it was done on a street called Avenue 15 in the movie. And they think it's arbitrary that they chose Chowchilla just because Chowchilla just happened to lie outside the 100-mile search radius from the quarry. And they figured the search radius would be contained to about 100 miles. And so if they picked a town that was more than 100 miles away from the quarry, that they would, avoid the searches and things like that. And Fred also being theatrical, I think maybe the fact that Chowchilla had numbered avenues, so they could do this on Avenue 21 in Chowchilla, whereas the bus was hijacked on Avenue 15 in the movie, that was kind of a theatrical type flair that Fred would add to a plan like this. Some say that the motive for this crime was that Fred and James had gotten into $30,000 in debt because they were trying to renovate and restore and move this mansion on a peninsula and all of that stuff. But, with Fred's family having that kind of money, it just seems odd that he would be in such a bad way over $30,000. I mean, we see people who are rich like that go and drop $30,000 on purses or watches or something like that in a single shopping trip, and they don't even bat an eye. So it just kind of doesn't sound right. And James further cast doubt on that theory because he said that his motive was he wanted to buy a Ferrari because all his neighbors had Ferraris and it was a keeping up with the Joneses kind of situation. So, for whatever reason, these rich kids decided to kidnap all these kids to demand a ransom. Anyway, Fred, not only was he mega rich to begin with, but he also, his family expected him to have some kind of job. So he worked at a rock quarry that was owned by his father. And it was called the California Rock Gravel Quarry. I'll give you one guess as to the quarry that Fred and all his criminal brilliance buried the children in. And it gets better. Because, as you would think, with the children crawling up out of this hole, where do you think the FBI began their search or their investigation? Right there at the rock and gravel quarry. Now, you have to think about these kind of super rich kids. They don't have any care for money. Fred even collected cars. He liked cars. So he had cars parked all around his apartment outbuilding. And him and James would just sit there with guns because they also collected guns. And they would just shoot out the windows of the cars Fred owned because money was nothing. Fred was kind of a sociopath. He was nonchalant about money to the point of just being delusional about it. Like money was nothing and things like that. It was almost like these were rich kids had planned this crime like after watching one too many movies and wanting to be the ultimate villain in their own movie. Fred and James, they were the major players in this plan. It kind of seems like James's younger brother Richard just got pulled along for the ride because they really didn't have any criminal records except for not too long before that, the three of them had stolen a vehicle and gotten in trouble for grand theft auto together. But the judge, looking at their wealth and their privilege and all of this stuff, felt like, this was just some boys having a good old time and they, rich kids and they were well connected. So, of course, they just get a fine and get to go on their way. So the FBI goes to this quarry where the kids crawl out of, where Fred is gainfully employed. And they talk to the security guard at the quarry, and the security guard says, in fact, a few months ago, I did see Mr. Woods' son, Fred, down in that area where the kids were, digging a large hole with a couple of his friends. And so they pulled up the surveillance footage. And the surveillance footage also showed Mr. Fred Woods and a couple guys digging a hole. So they looked at the criminal records and they see that Fred Woods was recently arrested with a couple guys. And these guys, the Schoenfeld brothers, they look exactly like the guys in the surveillance video with Fred digging the hole. So, of course, this is enough to immediately secure a warrant for the Woods estate as well as James and Richard's home. So they go and they serve these warrants and begin to search these estates. They found a treasure trove of evidence, especially at the Woods estate. At the Woods estate, they found one of the guns that was used to commit the crime, still there in Fred's apartment. They found a paper entitled Plan, Plan, Plan. And down the left side of the page on that column was the complete and total plan from beginning to end, along with another column that was sort of plan B, if you will. What to do if the things that we're planning go wrong, we will do this. In the plan, they had everything from how they were going to ask for the money to be dropped over the mountains, the forests, of these places that were dictated by lights, a plane dropping them. They talked about escaping in a plane where they had like parachutes on mannequins that they could toss from the plane to help throw off the cops. They had in there that they were going to use an x-ray machine to x-ray the money to make sure there was no bugs in the money. And sure enough, they'd even bought the x-ray machine. It was there. And my favorite line item in that plan was the line that said, burn the plan. So, geniuses there, pure genius. Luckily, they left behind their whole plan. So, didn't have to dig too much to find out what they were planning. They had a ransom note draft there that they had written where they had scratched out 5 million and put 2.5 million. So were they going to ask for 5 million? Were they going to ask for 2.5 million for the children? We don't know. They figured by everything they could tell that what they had said in the ransom note and everything else, that they were going to claim to be a satanic cult by the name of Beelzebub, which they also misspelled. That they were going to demand the ransom, and that the state of California, they had figured, had this big budget surplus that year, so that they were going to demand the money from the state of California, and they finally figured the state of California would pay to return all those innocent children. So of course they would. In their minds, it was almost a victimless crime because they figured the state just has this big surplus, so it's not money they needed anyway. We know we're not going to actually hurt the kids. If anything goes wrong, we're going to let them go right away. But they didn't even consider the mental and emotional trauma and damage of kidnapping people at gunpoint who have no idea that you have no intention to hurt them, who have no idea you have no intention to kill them. They're just kidnapped and buried alive, and they don't stop to think about how damaging that could be for the victims. It is not a victimless crime to do that. They had driven around scouting different towns, ultimately settled on Chowchilla. So it had been on the day of the kidnapping, it had been Richard Schoenfeld who had driven the green van that had the bus driver and Jody and Jennifer on it. It had been Fred Woods that drove the white van that came second, or that came first, and that Michael and the little 5-year-old were loaded on. And it had been James Schoenfeld who was remaining behind with the shotgun. on the van with the kids, and then he drove a spare van that followed those two vans when they kidnapped the children. They presumably drove around so long, just waiting for it to get to the wee hours of the morning where they could get into the quarry without being noticed and set up their tent to obstruct the view from the cameras, load the kids, unbury the hole, load the kids, and all that stuff. I like to think that they drove around so long because they're so dumb they got lost and couldn't find where they were going. They were just lost for 11 hours, but most likely they're driving around for a reason, just to wait till it got to the wee hours of the morning. Then once they got to the quarry, it turned out the reason why it took so long was James had to leave and go get the food. That's why the kids had such random food, because a 24-year-old who was not a very bright 24-year-old was the one sent to go get food for kids. So he just got like bread and peanut butter and potato chips and cereal without milk and stuff like that. In the meantime, Richard and Fred were having to hook up and get the ventilation system started because that was attached to batteries. So they were having to get that started. And then once they got everything ready, they got the hole uncovered because they had, of course, had it covered up after they buried that van and everything in there. Then they had to like redig like the opening open so that they could put the kids down. They couldn't just left it open for anyone to find in the quarry. So they had to redig that open, get the the ventilation system on board, get it running properly and all of that. Then they had started to pull out the kids after James had tossed the food down in there and stuff. And so when they were asking for the kids' names and ages, they were kind of so ill prepared and hadn't thought things out as well as they thought, because they ended up having to write all that down on a Jack in the Box wrapper. That's what they had done. And then after they locked the kids in, they drove back to Fred's apartment and they were going to make the ransom call from Fred's apartment. Except for, I don't know if you remember me mentioning how the Chowchilla Police Department, their phone lines were totally busy. So the kidnappers had tried and tried and tried and tried for hours to get a ransom call in to the local police department in Chowchilla to make their ransom demands, but they couldn't get the call through. And finally, they were just exhausted. So they decided that they were going to take a nap. And when they woke up from their nap, they would then make their ransom call. However, by the time they did finally take their nap and they woke up from that nap, they woke up to the news that evening that the children had escaped. So when they saw that the children had escaped and the jig was up, they decided to run their separate ways to make a run for it. So Fred had secured ahead of time a passport, and Richard, the younger of the two Schoenfeld brothers, he just went straight home and he told his dad. He confessed everything. He told his dad what they had done. His dad secured him a lawyer right away. Fred took his fake passport by the name of Ralph Schneider, and he went to Canada. He crossed the border successfully into Canada. James proceeded to try and make multiple attempts to cross the US Canadian border, but there were three problems with that. One, he was acting way too nervous, and the border guards could smell that from a mile away because he was just super nervous. Two, he had this really vague him and Han's story about what he was doing trying to go into Canada, and he had a car full of guns. He had brought like his entire gun collection and was trying to cross into Canada all nervous with a terrible cover story that made no sense with a car full of guns. So at three different border crossings, the border guards had just turned him away. No thank you, no entry, bye-bye. So he finally got frustrated and decided to go just turn himself in. There was an APB out on his plate, so luckily he was apprehended before he even had a chance to get all the way back and turn himself in. They were able to catch him. Fred, he wrote to a friend who was in film school requesting his friend make a movie about what he had done, about the kidnapping, and cut him in on the profits and stuff like that. And the postmark on the letter and things like that led to his arrest and capture in Vancouver, Canada. And so it was only a matter of a couple of weeks, and all the kidnappers were in custody. 5 weeks after their harrowing ordeal, the bus driver and the children, they were honored with a parade in Chowchilla, and they were sent on this magical Disney World vacation. The thought being that if they sent them on this, big Disney World vacation and made enough good memories, that those would overpower the bad memories of the kidnapping and everything the kids had gone through. But it really, didn't work. That's not how psychology works. A good experience doesn't cancel a bad one. So, but they tried. They, sent the kids and did those things. And then 16 months later, it was justice time. The kids had to face their kidnappers in court. And these kids were seated in the witness stand 15 feet away from their kidnappers. And these jerks were just staring down the kids, mean mugging them, staring them down. The kids were starting to cry on the stand. They were scared of these men. They were making them more afraid. So the judge said, no, we're not going to do this. Your fathers can sit with you as you testify. So after that, each child had their father sit with them up at the witness in the box, and they were able to testify with the comfort and security that their dads were there to protect them. There was a point of contention in the trial, basically, about whether or not the kidnappers had committed bodily injury. And the reason why this is a point of contention is the injuries the children suffered were rather minor: fainting spells, nosebleeds, scraped knees going down the ladder, little cuts on their fingers escaping. Ed Ray had some cuts on his fingers escaping. Some of them had heat exhaustion, those sorts of things. But none of them really had any serious physical injuries, but their injuries were more mental and emotional. But in 1976, they were looking at bodily injury, serious bodily injury. And so we had the perpetrators, the kidnappers, claiming we didn't hurt them. They were willing to plead guilty to kidnapping charges, but not to bodily injury, because if they said guilty to bodily injury, that would make their potential sentences life sentences without the possibility of parole. But if no bodily injury was found, then they would have the possibility of parole. The prosecutor was also going to place robbery charges against them because of the way they took items from each child as they put them in the hole. But ultimately, the prosecutors said they'd plead guilty to the kidnapping charges, they would drop the robbery charges. But they were found to have committed bodily injury, so they were sentenced each to 27 life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, 4 years later in 1980, this would be overturned, the finding of bodily injury, opening up their sentences to the possibility of parole. And most of the kids felt really betrayed and upset by this. And it was also very victimizing for the children, because 6 years after the kidnapping, the first parole hearings came up. And these kids had to come testify at parole hearings. So they'd be put in these little rooms, and the abductors would be right there in the little rooms with them. And then they'd have to go in and testify against them. But Jody, she never missed a hearing. She attended all three of their parole hearings, all 3 years, every 3 years, for the entirety of the rest of her life. In June 2012, after 35 years, Richard was released from prison. Then in August of 2015, his older brother James was next to be released. Fred Woods, he remained in prison the longest because he was very arrogant and entitled and dumb. And he kept breaking rules, rule violation, the rules don't apply to me. That's how he lived his whole life. The rules had never applied to him. Even when he committed Grand Theft Auto, the rules didn't apply to him. He was probably shocked that pleading guilty to the kidnapping charges didn't get him off on some crazy, easy thing. But regardless, he was caught with pornography, cell phones, things like that. He was even found to have broken the prison rules about running businesses from prison. He was running a gold mine, a car lot, a Christmas tree farm. And the only reason they found out that Fred was running any of these businesses from prison is the manager of the Christmas tree farm got hurt on the job and filed a workman's compensation claim. And when they were getting the workers' compensation claim stuff sorted out, they realized that the owner and the person who ran the business was an inmate in a California state prison. So anyway, finally Fred, he was granted parole in 2022 after being denied 17 times. Luckily for him, he had a big old mansion, waiting a 30-minute drive from the prison for himself. He had inherited his, hundreds of millions of dollar trust fund while he was in there. He was set for life. He had bought a mansion, and he was just waiting to get out so he could spend the rest of his life in the lap of luxury in his mansion, bragging about his ultimate crime, that he committed the largest mass kidnapping in U.S. history and how cool he was. His victims, they did sue him, a civil suit for what he had done to them. And each victim won just enough money, maybe for some serious therapy, not enough to buy a house, much less a mansion type of house. So really, the kidnappers ultimately, they fared kind of well. They get to spend their lives as free men the rest of their lives now and use their wealth. Larry Park, who was 6 at the time of kidnapping, he struggled with addiction for many years before he got clean and decided to forgive his kidnappers. Mike Marshall, He could never forgive them for what they had done to him. It wasn't so much for what they had done to him, but what they had put his mother through. He could not forgive them for what they had put his mother through. Jody, she remained in the local area. She wanted to be there to show up for every single parole hearing to make sure these men stayed in jail. She owned and ran a salon. She raised her son, but she always struggled to find any peace of mind in her life after that. And she ultimately passed away at the age of 55, having never missed a single one of the hearings for any of the kidnappers. Ed Ray, the bus driver, he was given like a luxury vacation. He got to appear on Hollywood Squares and he was always hailed as the true hero of the situation, which, I mean, Mike really was the true unsung hero, I think, because of all his actions. But Mike was fine to let Ed Ray take all that spotlight and all that credit. Ed did play a role in it. Him and Michael kind of team rescued all the children. Michael was happy to be the unsung hero and let Ray take all the spotlight for the most part in the aftermath of this kidnapping. Ed, he kept driving school buses for the next 12 years. He and most of the children on the bus that day, they stayed lifelong friends. And even as Ed Ray passed away of old age, well loved, well respected in his community, most of the children from Chowchilla as adults still came to say their goodbyes on his deathbed. Fred Woods, I guess, technically got his wish. A movie was eventually made about the kidnappings called They've Taken Our Children, the Chowchilla Kidnapping story. However, Woods did not get any share of the profit for that one. And a lot of the families were kind of so so. Ed was portrayed as the big hero in the movie, and it was filmed in the plains of Kansas, which a lot of people felt was kind of a sad substitute for the San Joaquin Valley of California. Ultimately, that kind of concludes our tale of the largest mass kidnapping in US history. So I hope you really enjoyed this video. Be sure to hit that like button, hit subscribe if you don't want to miss the next upload. And overall, I just want to thank you for stopping by. Be sure to stay safe, stay aware, and listen to your gut because the horrors persist, but so do we. Thank you for watching. Bye.